Hi, I'm Peter Cowan, the Bee Whisperer. Today I'm going to talk to you a bit about pollen and how you make pollen patties. In particular, it's probably useful to understand the actual value of pollen to the bees. Pollen is the bee's source of protein. Pollen is needed for growth, and it's also needed for the bees to have protein available to give to other bees. And the way they do that is the production of royal jelly. The nurse bee, the young worker bee, whose role it is to feed both the queen and other young larvae, produce a substance called royal jelly from a gland in the worker bee's forehead, the pharyngeal gland. This is a very high protein substance, which is the protein source initially for the developing very young larvae, and it's the very high protein source for the queen, who has to produce virtually her own weight in eggs per day. So pollen is critical to allow the colony both to be healthy and to increase their number, so production of brood. In an overwintered colony, pollen is available in two forms to the bees. The natural pollen, which has been stored the winter before under the honey and is available in the combs, and that pollen which is coming in fresh from the trees, if there is any, and if the weather is conducive to collecting it. But the other source of protein that the bees have in the spring is within their own bodies. Their own resources are there. And this is why, one of the reasons why the bees produce a very fat bee in late summer, early fall. These overwintering bees have very high fat and protein contents in their body. And even with a lack of stored pollen in the hive and a lack of pollen coming out of the trees, the bees have it within their own bodies to produce enough royal jelly, enough protein to rear at least one set of brood. So basically enough brood to replace themselves. And this turnover of the population takes place usually gradually over the late winter, early spring, and predominantly in this area it would be around the April time. And that basically by the time you're into May, you have very few overwintered bees, and it's all brand new bees. And a good deal of that protein came within the bodies of the bees that have just recently died. And so bees have a remarkable way of turning protein over, and they can do it in other ways too. We'll talk about that in a minute. This video is going to talk about making pollen patties to supplement the bees' feed, but a little bit more on the value of the pollen to the bees themselves. If we have bad weather in the spring, the bees may have just turned over the population of bees in the hive. The bees have utilized the protein sources they have stored in the hive. If we have bad weather and the bees cannot go out and collect fresh pollen, now the colony has a real problem. Not only will the lack of pollen coming in postpone any further laying of eggs by the queen, but what it will also do is the bees will recognize this pollen lack of protein. The colony goes into what we call protein stress, and they will actually cannibalize the eggs and the young larvae. And so not only have you lost days of egg production, but you've lost days behind that where they've already produced the larvae. They eat them to conserve that protein, because the worker bees are aware of the fact that if they try to rear these brood coming in now, with the lack of pollen coming in, they're just going to starve later on. And so what they have to do is they hold back, they cannibalize the larvae that are there, and wait till protein can come into the hive. And this is where adding pollen patties can really come to save the day. Because the last thing we want as a beekeeper is our colonies to have their growth stopped in its tracks by a lack of protein in the hive. And that's why I get so distressed when I hear the weather forecasters say an upper level low is centering over Maine, because that means 2 or 3 weeks of bad, wet, cold, windy weather at a time when the bees could have otherwise been going out to get protein, pollen, and maybe a little bit of nectar. And so that means my colonies will not grow any further. In fact, they may shrink unless I do something about it. And that's why when I prepare my hives in the spring, as soon as the weather permits, I will go out there and start adding pollen patties to my hives to start building up the brood. And not only that, it provides a backup in case we get one of these upper level lows, and they're going to have days on days without being able to go out and get fresh pollen. Fresh pollen is much better than pollen patties, because pollen patties cannot match the quality of that fresh and diversity of that fresh product, but it is a good substitute, and it will keep a brood batch going, and it will stimulate the rearing of more brood. And so whilst we'll do better with fresh pollen coming in, and the bees will immediately switch over to the fresh pollen when that's coming in, the pollen patties are a great alternative and will stop the colony going into protein stress. So pollen patties can be used to stimulate brood production, and it can be used to save brood production and keep it going in times of bad weather. But a word of warning: the danger of feeding pollen patties to overwintered colonies too early in the season is normally what a colony will do is start to rear new brood when pollen starts to come into the colony. When their maples come into bloom and they're able to get some fresh pollen, this is their cue: start rearing brood. The danger comes if we give pollen to those bees too early, maybe a few weeks before the normal pollen bloom. Their honey resources will normally last them a certain amount of time. So they're geared up, they've stored honey to typically last of a certain period without rearing much brood. But if you start brood rearing early, that population starts to soar and their consumption of honey rockets. Unless we can actually provide more sugar syrup or there's plenty of honey in the hive, you can stimulate a colony to outgrow its resources and starve to death in the spring. So it is dangerous. You've got to make sure that, number one, there's enough honey in the hive, or number two, you can provide an alternative source of sugar syrup to the bees in a way in which they can get at it. In other words, it's not going to be too cold for them to take it. It's not going to be too dilute so that they can't get out to defecate. And so we've got to be very careful about feeding pollen patties. So I will feed pollen patties. I will make sure that my colonies aren't in a position to starve. But if in doubt, don't do it until you know that spring is on the way. The bees are rearing their brood. They've got enough honey. But you can provide pollen patties as a backup in case we get some bad weather during the normal build-up time. At that time, it's usually warm enough to be feeding them with sugar syrup and be able to make sure that the colony doesn't go into either protein stress or sugar starvation. What I'm going to do now is mix up some pollen substitute. I'm going to mix it with 2-to-1 sugar syrup, that heavy sugar syrup that we made in a previous video, and we'll make it into a pliable consistency and make up patties that I can give to the bees later on this spring. If you like what you're hearing so far, don't forget to press that subscribe button. When I'm making pollen patties, I tend to use more than one supply of dry pollen substitute. The reason being is that different manufacturers make up their pollen substitute in different ways. And this is still a developing science. And so what I would prefer to do is have as broad a spectrum of food resources in that pollen as possible, while still not reinventing the wheel and not adding all sorts of interesting things on my own. As I study more, I will find out more suitable things I can be adding to the pollen mixture. So what I'm using here is a couple of different types. This one is B Pro, and what I'm going to just do is, the mixture is not going to be that precise. What I'm going to be doing is putting roughly half of this pollen substitute, B Pro, and half of that one, Ultra B. I could be using different ones, but these have worked pretty well for me so far. And I'm going to put roughly a 50% mixture of each of these into the bucket, and I'm going to add some sugar syrup, some 2-to-1 sugar syrup, to make it into a paste. And the exact ratio I can work out, but I'll do it by eye until I'm satisfied with consistency, which will change a little bit over time because this dry material will gradually absorb the sugar. So whatever consistency I make today, it'll be a bit stiffer tomorrow. So I'll make it a little bit loose, a bit runny today, a bit wet today, because tomorrow it should be fairly firm. So I'll put in a roughly 50% ratio of these two products. So that's about 2/3 of a jug. You're going to get covered in yellow dust here. About 1.5 jugs there. Open up this bag. So this is what it looks like. It's a powder. Looks very much like pollen, but it's made of things like yeast and soy flour, that sort of stuff. Don't do this in the kitchen. Do it out in the garage or something like that, because you're going to make a mess. Okay, so that's about a 50-50 mix. Now I'll add some sugar syrup. Should have used the other container. Now we'll mix it up. Easier on the ground. That looks pretty close to me. So let's have a look at this. It's pretty thick, and it's going to thicken up more. So right now, this is a bit thin. If I put this in the colony, it would just run down in the frames. But I would say by tomorrow, the dry grains in here will have absorbed enough of that sugar syrup to make it pretty stiff. And I think it'll be just about right. I might mix it up a little bit more because I've got a few dry lumps in there. So I'll mix it up a little bit more, and then we'll see how it looks. So what I'm going to do is I'll use little wax paper bags. They are roughly, well, I'd say that's I think it's 5 inch by 7 inch. Put a bit more. not going to weigh it out precisely. Basically what I'm going to do, fold that over, flatten it out. And this is going to harden up a bit by tomorrow. But here we have a nice pollen substitute patty. It will, it's about a 1/4 inch thick. I would say it weighs about 2/3 of a pound, so about 10 ounces or so. This will keep a colony going for several days of brood rearing first thing in the spring. So I'll make a few more. It is a messy process. It actually helps to have 2 people. I remember last spring I had some help doing this. Someone to hold the bags open while someone puts this in, because otherwise everything gets covered. So where are you, Jordan? You gave me a lot of help last spring. I could do with a bit more. Well, that one's a mess. That's a real mess, that one. So you may find it easier. What I will do in some hives is I'll just put this straight on the frames. But what we're looking to do is make a neater product like this patty. So smaller scoops at a time, probably the answer. There we have it. So in this wax paper bag, the bees will eat their way through the wax paper. No problem, they'll cart out the little bits of paper. But this is a great way to make up your pollen patties for the spring. So there's our pollen patties. They work extremely well. This is a great way of getting pollen into the, or pollen substitute, or something like pollen, a good protein source, into the hive, right on the brood chamber, just when the bees need it the most. It's a great insurance policy for bad weather, and it's going to make sure the bees don't go into protein stress. In better weather, we can just give them the powder. We can have the bees go and help themselves to stations where the bees can fly to, pick up the pollen and take it away, but you need good weather for that. This is the way to get it into the hive if there's any risk that they cannot get out of the hive to collect it themselves. I hope you found that helpful. If you did, please make sure you press that subscribe button. It helps me a lot. My name is Peter Cowan. I'm the Bee Whisperer. I'll see you next time.